MTN is one of the world's largest mobile phone companies with large businesses, as we know, in Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana and Iran.
Indeed, it's also got smaller businesses in all sorts of other countries in Africa and the Middle East. Brings you to over 230 million customers. I mentioned earlier Vodacom's only got like 65 or 70. This one's a lot larger.
Market cap 238 billion rand, price to earnings ratio of 17.3 and a dividend yield here of 10.2%. As you said earlier, the stalwart of the telecommunications environment when it comes to an investment decision. Most people have been long MTN for as long as I've been sitting on the news desk.
Absolutely. It's one of the best ways to play the African telecommunications space. Ultimately, it's one of the final frontiers for voice growth, which is nice and high margin, as well as for data growth. Africa still is the place to be, and the Middle East is exactly the same. And MTN's your best play.
And it's got, so this is a double-edged sword, because Nigeria is what has really flattened MTN to this point.
Absolutely.
But it's also got the biggest consumer population on the African continent.
Yes, and you kind of want to think that once Nigeria gets it together and everything starts going a little bit more smoothly, you've got a smoother and more favorable regulatory environment. If you've got a market-leading position in Nigeria, you are going to be huge. It's going to be massive. And that's what MTN, I think, was bargaining on when they entered Nigeria. They are the market leader there. It just seems to have kind of been halted at the moment.
And of course, that's a function of the fine that they ran into, because the Nigerian government's contention was that they had left people on the system that hadn't been rekeyed. I'm using that term, it's a South African term. That's where you got to get your ID and your proof of residence and some biometric information, which seemed kind of crazy, because if you've got a country where you're trying to get fast growth and it's a big key into economic growth, to get excessively regulatory oriented and then to impose a massive fine on your largest foreign investors, it's just crazy.
Let's look at the damage that has been done to the share price here.
And it's sort of mentioned, so there you go, it gets to like 240 and it's now languishing around 125 and thereabouts. We've held them all the way down on that right-hand shoulder.
I perhaps just want to set out the history that you have with MTN. I think for as long as I've known you, MTN has been one of your favorite stocks.
Yeah, we started accumulating them in 2003. When they were 12 rands a share. So those people that did that have still got a 10 bagger now, but of course it was much better. And it's been a great success story, because people didn't think they'd make as much money in this country where they're the number 2, and then Nigeria was like, whoa, and then Iran. Iran's got like nearly 90 million people, lots of young people, relatively, substantial net GDP per capita, so it's a great potential market. That has benefited from the fall in sanctions. There's a lot to be said for it.
There's a lot to be said, but as you set out earlier, you have made the switch into Vodacom.
Yes, at this point in time, it's an opportunity cost story. We're struggling with transparency. You've got uncertain management future. You've got issues in Nigeria.
CEO is gone.
Yeah, you're still not sure whether they're going to be able to repatriate the money out of Iran. Everything's kind of stuck at the moment. And how long is it going to be? What is the situation going to be like? And you mentioned earlier that earnings visibility is so important to investors. So from a long-term investment perspective, if you have very limited earnings visibility, is this going to be 3 years at 130 or 125? It's an opportunity cost story.
It comes down to that opportunity cost. And Paul, that's the question that you need to answer. Is the opportunity cost of holding MTN worth it for our hot stocks portfolio?
Look, I mean, Nigeria faces a lot of important choices. It's got to deal with its currency, and there's ambivalence about whether or not to let it float freely or not, but it also needs to deal with this issue, and it now appears that what has happened is President Buhari has kicked this issue back to the parliament, which is asked to re-look at the law with regard to fines related to regulatory compliance. So I think what's going to happen...
Which means that the end isn't in sight anytime soon.
But at the same time, it's clear that what they're grasping for is a solution, but they're looking for a sort of face-saving solution. And the tabled proposal from MTN is that they'll invest a certain amount in Nigerian sovereign bonds, and that they'll invest a certain amount in network expansion. And so there's a lot of horse trading going on. I think it would be silly to exit stage left when the potential for a substantial bump upwards in the share price on resolution of this issue is imminent.
So
hot or not? Oh, well, yes, carry on. No, don't give me hot or not yet. I want to hear what you've got to say.
Just a last point on this. I mean, as we mentioned in the beginning, MTN great prospects in the very long term. We just don't know how long that long term is. But there is going to come a time when if you don't own MTN, you want to own MTN. And it's a very difficult call when you're actually already in the stock.
Would you look for another entry point then, Chantal? You're not in a hurry do you believe that there's going to be a better entry point
Absolutely.
into MTN?
Maybe in 2 years' time, when all of this stuff has been figured out. Maybe it's in 7 or 8 months' time when everything has been figured out. But there is going to be a time to get into MTN again, which makes it very complicated when you hold a big position.
Hot or not?
Definitely hot for me. Definitely not a time to be selling. In fact, if anything, if you've got a high risk tolerance, you could accumulate a few.
You like to play with us on this show. The glowing report from Vodacom, and then he's kind of thinking about, but at the end of the day, just stands by your decision. Hot or not?
It'll have to be long-term hot, but short-term, I'm very cautious. So probably a not.
A not. I can't give you any leeway. Rephrase yourself. Is it a not or a hot?
It's a not.
A not hot.